It is the Resistance Report for May 23rd, 2017. Good evening. Do any of you possibly remember Senator Pat Moynihan, Daniel Patrick Moynihan? Before becoming senator, he was a professor, and a distinguished professor. He was a sociologist and a political scientist in many respects, but he had one theory that he propounded that was questionable at the time. It had something to it, but it also was questionable. He had a theory of defining deviance downward. Now, what he meant by defining deviancy downward was simply this, that if society tolerated unacceptable behavior, that unacceptable behavior would become the norm. Now, again, there was something to that. If you looked at, in fact, he looked at broken windows. And if there was a part of the city that had broken windows, the chances were, and nothing was improved, and those broken windows stayed broken, then, according to Daniel Patrick Moynihan's theory, other windows would get broken. In fact, the whole social norm of the area of the city would start to decline. And many conservatives picked up this notion of defining deviancy downward to attack liberals for being too tolerant of unacceptable behavior, usually unacceptable behavior among young people, and often among people who many conservatives didn't like very much. I'm reminded of this theory of defining deviancy downward because of Donald Trump. I don't recall a national leader, certainly not a president of the United States, who has contributed so much to defining deviancy downward in terms of reducing, eliminating, compromising social norms. Social norms that were very important and are very important in the United States and the world. For example, take the social norm about lying, publicly lying, even when there is evidence against you. Presidents didn't do that. They did tell sometimes some lies, or they elaborated on the truth, or they were spinning the truth. But when they were confronted with the truth and they couldn't get away from it, they changed their story. Well, that's not true, obviously, of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is defining deviancy downward. I am hearing more politicians, particularly Republicans, who seem to have no qualms about telling whoppers, even when there is no basis for those whoppers. They are, in effect, they are copying Trump, or take denigrating basic democratic values, our court system, the importance of a free press. Well, we took them for granted. They were part of the social contract. But we have a president now that denigrates those values, that demeans those democratic institutions, and suddenly we hear other people in public life denigrating and demeaning democratic institutions. Name-calling, hatefulness. Well, it happened before Donald Trump, obviously, but when you have a president who engages in ad hominem attacks, who does name-calling and also exhibits and tolerates hatefulness, well, it becomes more socially acceptable. And we have more of it. Hate crimes on the rise. Hate crimes were not on the rise before Donald Trump. Hate crimes are now on the rise in the United States. Celebrating tyrants around the world, something the United States maybe in the 1950s did, the CIA often did quietly, but we never openly, and a president of the United States never openly celebrated tyrants around the world the way Donald Trump is celebrating tyrants. I've just come back from Europe, and many of the people I met with, people who are in official positions of responsibility in other countries in Europe, what are they most concerned about? They're most concerned that Donald Trump seems not to be interested in democracy. He's more interested in tyranny. He's making peace with, or at least sounding as if he tolerates and even likes Putin and other people around the world who are tyrants by almost anybody's definition of tyranny. And a lot of these Europeans are concerned that Donald Trump, simply by cozying up to tyrants, is making it more difficult for democratic leaders, for people who really care about democracy in Europe and elsewhere around the world. Again, defining deviancy downward, using his office for his own personal wealth and his family's wealth. Well, that's something that you might expect in a two-bit dictatorship, but here in the United States, when Donald Trump does that, and he seems to be getting away with it, when he seems to be getting away with things that were not acceptable behavior, a lot of people begin to say to themselves, well, wait a minute, maybe I can get away with things that are not generally acceptable behavior. Maybe I can make a little bit of money on the side. There is a little bit of evidence accumulating that corruption is growing. Stopping at nothing to win the presidency. Well, that's part of today's theme, because there were hearings today in Congress where you had several former intelligence agency chiefs and several current intelligence agency chiefs talk about Donald Trump's disrespect for our democratic institutions with regard to the likelihood that he actually, or members of his staff, did collude with Russians in rigging the 2016 election. John Brennan, who was CIA head last year, he said to Congress today that not only did he become aware of a lot of contacts between Donald Trump's aides and Russian operatives in the campaign season, but he also, at the same time, became concerned about all of this. In other words, it wasn't just that he became aware of it, he also said in testimony today that he became concerned about what he was learning. Well, the evidence is mounting that Donald Trump, who has spent his life doing everything he can to win, stopping at absolutely nothing, stopped at nothing with regard to winning the presidency. Again, defining deviancy down. Behavior that was not acceptable in all these respects becomes a little bit more acceptable. People say, I didn't know a president could do that. Well, a president couldn't do that because presidents were constrained by social norms and assumptions about what good behavior was. But now that a president seems to be getting away with all of this, what is going to happen to the social norms that our society runs by, the social contract that is implicit in so much of what we do every day? In other words, Donald Trump is setting an example for our society that defines deviancy downward. And now comes his budget. Now, budgets, public budgets, president's budgets, and congressional budgets are overall expressions of a nation's values and priorities. That's what they are. Donald Trump's budget that he released today can only be described as cruel. And in that cruelty is also deviance. I have never come across a budget that so clearly took from the vulnerable in our society in order to reward the rich in our society. And did it completely openly, did it unabashedly. Donald Trump proposes to cut federal spending by more than $3.6 trillion over the next decade, much of the savings coming from programs that help the poor and the needy and the vulnerable and the working class. Medicaid, cuts in Medicaid, cuts in food stamps, cuts in Social Security disability, cuts in health insurance for poor children. And what are all these cuts for? They are for expanding the military and cutting corporate taxes and cutting taxes on the wealthy. Now again, Trump's budget is not going to get through Congress. That's not the point. The point is that this budget defines deviancy downward. It sets a new low norm for what is acceptable in our society. For example, it imposes huge burdens on people who already are hurting and vulnerable. It's not just the poor, but also working class people, people who are sick. In fact, among the biggest losers in this budget, if it ever were enacted, would be people who voted for Donald Trump. White working class people in poor rural areas of this country. They depend on Medicaid and on food stamps and on Social Security disability. Do you think they'll ever find out what Donald Trump is trying to do to them? Because the final budget that comes out is not going to be this budget. This, again, is Donald Trump's representation of his values, of what he thinks America ought to look like. What he is going to tell these people, and what Trump's surrogates are already spinning about this budget, is that the budget is designed to help people take more responsibility for themselves. Well, you believe that? I have a bridge to sell you. Another aspect of this defining deviancy downward ideology, it frowns on any help to anybody in need, because it's assumed that they are not taking responsibility for themselves. This goes beyond tough love. I know people who are in need not because they have not taken responsibility, but because they have got sick. They've become sick through no fault of their own. I know people who are needy because they've fallen on hard times. I know people who are needy because they've lost jobs. I know people who are needy because they've had bad luck. Do you? Most people who are needy would like to work, would like to be responsible. Most people in this country who are vulnerable not because they made themselves vulnerable, but because of all of these kinds of reasons: bad luck and illness and disability and losing jobs and so on. And what about children who will be losing out, losing health care, losing other aspects of public support? Are children being irresponsible? Are children the ones who have not taken care of themselves? Defining deviancy downward, changing the social norms of this country, ripping up the social contract of this country. Donald Trump's budget sets a new low bar for congressional and public debate over social insurance in the United States. Social insurance. I mean, we in the United States, we don't have nearly as much social insurance as most other advanced nations do. They have universal health care, for example. We don't have anything close, but at least we do have some aspects of a safety net, and that safety net is in place because we know some people could fall through. Some people could be in trouble. But what does this budget do? It pushes this idea, this odd idea, that each of us is and should be on our own, that we are not part of a community, we're not part of a society, we're not part of a nation. And therefore, if bad things happen to us, that's our own problem. Social insurance, the idea of social insurance is spreading the costs and the risks of adversity. Everybody understands social insurance. And yet Donald Trump is basically throwing out the idea of social insurance. Today, White House Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Mick Mulvaney, this is what he said about all of this. He said, government should show compassion for low-income Americans, but it should also, here are his words, also have compassion for folks who are paying for it, unquote. What does that mean? What does that mean? That is illogical. It eliminates justification for social insurance altogether. What do you mean compassion for people who don't need social insurance? The whole purpose of social insurance is, again, to make sure that we're spreading the risks and the costs of bad things happening. So what does it mean to have compassion for people who are paying for it? You're separating out the people who are paying for it from the people who are benefiting from it. They're not two separate classes of people. We are all Americans. You know, this whole notion of making America great again, well, that is baloney. That is rubbish. According to this doctrine, this view of who we are, we're just a bunch of individuals who happen to be here in a place called the United States, with no responsibility for each other at all, no social insurance. This budget frames the debate over Trump care, which will be voted on soon. There will be a replacement bill in the Senate coming up pretty soon, but it shapes the debate in the following way. It allows, for example, somebody who is healthy to say to themselves, why should I pay for somebody who has a pre-existing sickness? Do you understand? That is the illogic of this attack on social insurance. Why should I, if I'm healthy, well, why should I pay for them if they're sick? Mick Mulvaney says we should be compassionate toward people who are paying. Well, I'm sorry. If it really is the case that we're all in this together, then we should be compassionate for and toward each other, toward all of us. In other words, this view of America assumes that we are all selfish, self-interested, that we don't give a damn about anybody but ourselves. It's a little bit like Donald Trump, isn't it? Finally, this budget essentially eviscerates, eliminates the notion that an important aspect of patriotism involves sacrificing for the common good. Now, when I was growing up, now maybe this is old-fashioned, but when I was growing up, the idea of patriotism was not exclusion of other people from the United States. No, the idea of patriotism was we have an obligation to sacrifice for the common good. The supreme sacrifice, obviously, being going to war and losing one's life, but many other smaller sacrifices, like supporting each other, paying taxes, making sure that roads and bridges were in good order. Even if we were not going to specifically use that road or that bridge, other people were going to use it. Making sure that schools were good, even if we didn't have children, for example. We had a stake in making sure that the children in our community had good schools. That was part of the social contract. That was part of patriotism. Making sure that the environment was clean. Even Richard Nixon passed the Environmental Protection Act in 1970 because we assumed that it was a matter of public health. Clean air, clean water. We owed it to each other. It was part of patriotism. But what we are getting from this defining deviancy downward budget, what we are getting from Donald Trump, and we are getting it from him in every way, is the notion that no, patriotism has nothing to do with sacrifice for the common good. Patriotism is just about waving the American flag and saying we are better than anybody else. Donald Trump's budget celebrates a cruel and virulent form of individualism. I've got mine and the hell with you. Much like Donald Trump himself. Before Donald Trump, this view of America was considered deviant. People did have the view. There were people around who had that view, but it was a deviant view. But Donald Trump is defining deviancy downward. Folks, we're better than this. We are better than Donald Trump. We're better than this budget. Most Americans actually are patriotic in the sense of feeling that we are all in this together and we are all sacrificing for the common good. Most Americans do feel compassion for people who are vulnerable and needy. Most Americans are willing to pay their taxes. They worry that government is not efficient. Yes, that's a worry. But they're willing to pay their taxes to make sure that there is at least a minimal social safety net. We are better than Donald Trump's budget, and we are better than Donald Trump. Now your questions. Travis Fallon. Given the illegitimacy of Trump's entire presidency, can we organize a repeal and replacement effort? Impeachment isn't enough. His entire cabinet needs to be rolled back. Would a general strike be enough to force a new election? Travis, I certainly empathize and sympathize with your views. In fact, I've publicly said that if he is impeached on the basis of collaborating or colluding with the Russians to win the election, that impeachment is not enough, that we ought to have his presidency annulled, actually annulled, so that, for example, all his executive orders ought to be eliminated. Anything that he has done separate from Congress ought to be null and void. And even listing as the 45th President of the United States, there ought to be an asterisk that said, no, that was annulled, and the 45th President ought to be the next president. But here's the problem. Anything that Congress has done over the last 4 months or during the Trump administration, we're not going to be able to annul that. Because, remember, the Constitution, the handy-dandy Constitution, which I had a copy of right here. I don't know where it is. I always have my Constitution near me. But anyway, there is no provision in the Constitution for the kind of annulment that you are suggesting. Oh, here is my Constitution. Always keep it close. Always keep it within arm's length. There's no provision, and I've checked this very carefully. But, look, impeachment and annulment are certainly possible. Nathan Gurnett. Trump's proposed budget is literally the opposite of everything he campaigned on. At what point are his followers going to understand this? Or are they a cult and is following him a sign of insanity? Well, Nathan, I don't think they're a cult. I think many people voted for Donald Trump because, frankly, they didn't like the alternative. You remember this election was, for many people, an election between who you hated more, Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. And I'm not saying they are right, obviously, but a lot of people felt that way. I've come in contact over the last months with many people who voted for Donald Trump and said they can't stand Donald Trump. So let's not fall into the trap of assuming that every Trump voter is part of a cult or is insane. Many of them never liked him, and some of the people who did fall for his promises are, in fact, waking up. The polls are showing that even among Trump voters, it's slow, but his approval ratings are declining. They're not all falling for it. Martin Jessen. What exactly is Trump proposing to do about the work requirement for food stamps? Well, Martin, you understand that the food stamp program, SNAP it's called, that program does require, generally speaking, that people work in order to be eligible for food stamps. Now, there is a waiver provision for areas of high unemployment. So if you are poor and you need food stamps, you can't find a job because there is high unemployment, there are not jobs available, you still can get food stamps. But what Trump wants to do is eliminate that waiver provision. In other words, the Trump budget says, in effect, the only way you can get food stamps is by working, even if there are no jobs available in your area. In other words, you don't get food stamps. Talk about cruel. You know, let me just say this. What we know is 1 out of every 3 families in America at some point in time is dependent on public assistance. 1 out of 3. And that's nothing to be ashamed of. Because everybody, almost everybody, certainly 1/3 of us fall on hard times. We need things like food stamps. We need Medicaid. Arlene Alessandre, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, does Trump believe in science? His budget suggests he doesn't. And if he doesn't, why not? Well, Arlene, the budget does call for a major cut, about 17% cut, in science and research that is supported by the federal government. Now, that's basic science, and by that I simply mean this is not the kind of scientific research that private corporations would do, because it is basic. It is available to anybody. It is basic knowledge. It's new knowledge. Now, when the federal government cuts that kind of research by 17%, that is a huge problem. That means that the Centers for Disease Control, for example, or the National Institutes of Health, or the National Endowments for the Science, all of these lose huge amounts of money and cannot, therefore, do the scientific research needed to protect us. I mean, the Center for Disease Control, for example, is one of the major places that we rely on to get information on and prevent epidemics. Trump wants to basically cut that. I think, honestly, the reason he wants to cut science is because he doesn't want truth. This is a man who is afraid of truth. The truth about global climate change. The truth about, for example, inoculation and whether it has any relationship, as he thinks it does, to various forms of mental illness. The truth about even who voted and how many people actually voted fraudulently. This is a man who bases his entire pitch, his entire career, his entire life on lies, on falsities. So obviously he doesn't want to support science, because science can find him to be completely a joke. Marcia Greenstein, what are the exact steps to a Trump impeachment? I'm tired of waiting. This moron has to go. Well, Marcia, there are a lot of people who agree with you, but the steps are pretty straightforward. The House of Representatives and the leadership in the House has got to, number one, give to the House Judiciary Committee the responsibility to investigate and see if there are enough reasons to impeach and come up with a bill of impeachment. The Judiciary Committee then reports back to the House with a bill of impeachment, and then the House votes. Now, Richard Nixon didn't even wait to the House vote. All Richard Nixon needed to resign was that first step. The House Judiciary Committee came up with a bill of impeachment of Richard Nixon, and he resigned. He didn't want to go to the full House. But if it does go to the full House, then that's not the end of it. Once it goes to the House, once the House votes, even if it votes for impeachment, then it has to go to the Senate. And that's where you get either a conviction of impeachment or you get a decision not to convict. You need 2/3 of the Senate to convict, to actually impeach. And so far, the 3 impeachments or near impeachments we've had, Richard Nixon, Bill Clinton, and also President Johnson, Andrew Johnson, not Lyndon Johnson, Andrew Johnson, president right after Lincoln, they were acquitted. That is, Bill Clinton and Andrew Johnson were both acquitted in the Senate. So impeachment is very, very hard. There's not been a president who has actually been kicked out of office. Okay, 2 more questions. Peter Oslo. Today, former CIA Director John Brennan said the U.S. intelligence agencies had picked up contacts between Russia and people involved in the Trump campaign, and that these contacts had convinced him or concerned him. Isn't this the beginning of the end? Well, Peter, I don't know that it's the beginning of the end. I thought it was the beginning of the end several times over the past few weeks, and maybe it is. Margaret Dempsey, is the terrorist attack in England going to help Trump? Margaret, I think that any terrorist attack around the world that claims a lot of lives can be used by demagogues to point the finger of blame, to spread fear, to heighten a kind of anxiety. What we need, obviously, are presidents who, like Franklin D. Roosevelt, did exactly the opposite, said that what we have to fear most is fear itself. And make sure that people understand that even though you have terrorist acts, the possibility of actually dying or being hurt by an act of terrorism is infinitesimally small, even in Europe right now. But it feels large because obviously these are terrible incidents, and we all read about them, and we see them in the news. Donald Trump is probably going to use this. He's used everything else he can to spread fear and hate, and he's probably going to use this. Okay, this is the last one. Ginny Laplatinier. Fox News has retracted its story about the death of former DNC staffer Seth Rich. Does this mean Sean Hannity will stop his irresponsible and hurtful tirades on this subject? Ginny, in a short, no. Sean Hannity will be able to and can do what he wants. He brings in a lot of money to Fox News, and presumably he's going to continue to do this. It is irresponsible and is very hurtful to the family of Seth Rich, but nevertheless, Sean Hannity is going to do it. I know Sean Hannity, or at least I knew him in the late 1990s. He asked me on his show a number of times. I went on his show. And then one time, I remember, I think it was 1999. This is the last time, I think it was the last time I've been on Fox News. In 1999, Sean Hannity asked me a question, and my response to the question was, this is typical for Fox Republican News. I stuck in Republican in that Fox News. And Sean Hannity didn't like that a bit. And during the station break, he started screaming at me in my earbud. I was in a different place. And he said, "You are my guest on my show. How dare you say Fox Republican News?" And I said, "I don't care." And he said, "Well, then I'm never inviting you back." I said, "Good." And that was the end of that. I think Sean Hannity is basically a blowhard. I think that he is kind of the last to go. Hopefully, people and commercial sponsors will stop supporting his show. Maybe you can find a list of the commercial sponsors that are supporting his show, and maybe you can stop patronizing them, put some pressure on them, so we can get rid of Sean Hannity. We do have a little bit of time. All right. Selma Reinster. Will Trump emerge from his foreign tour as a statesman? It's absurd to think so, but so far no tweets and no really dumb moves. Well, Selma, the reason there have been no tweets and the reason there have been not terribly dumb moves, there have been some dumb moves, is because this whole trip, Donald Trump has been choreographed very carefully. There's more control now exerted on Donald Trump, keeping him very busy. There have been a number of reports that the people around him are almost using this trip as a vehicle to get Donald Trump under control and out of the U.S. limelight and out of the possibility of tweeting and causing him to go deeper and deeper into his own hole, digging himself deeper and deeper. Now, I don't know. The Donald Trump that we know is a Donald Trump that is not easily controlled. Maybe he's more easily controlled on the road. That seems to be the case. And finally, this does have to be the last, Mark Brockton. I can't figure out whether Trump's budget is balanced over 10 years or not. What gives? Mark, You got to understand, this budget is not balanced. This budget will dramatically increase the deficit and the debt. The only reason that Donald Trump can say it's balanced is because he's using wild assumptions about economic growth, that we're going to have something in the order of 4% economic growth, and that tax cuts are going to generate all of this growth. This is bizarre supply-side, trickle-down economics. It's already been shown to be absolute rubbish, and anybody who scores, that is, actually looks at this budget and figures out, as I hope the Congressional Budget Office is going to do, figures out what the costs are, will see that it is going to basically cause huge, huge deficits and increase the debt. For what purpose? To give very wealthy people and big corporations a giant tax cut and expand the military. Again, we're back to not just dollars and cents, we're back to morality. And if there's one issue that I want to leave you with tonight, it's that the issues underlying this budget, underlying much of what Donald Trump has been up to, are less political issues than they are issues of public morality. They're issues of norms, of breaking the norms, of breaking the social contract. And this, again, is where you all come in, because it is your outrage, your pressure on members of Congress that are constraining Donald Trump from even doing worse. The reason that we have pushback in Congress, the reason that members, even Republicans, are beginning to distance themselves from Donald Trump, the reason that we have a lot of, and more people who are in official positions in agencies, in federal courts and elsewhere, are willing to stand up to Trump, is that they're hearing more and more of you speaking truth, talking to not only your members of Congress, but also your local press, making a ruckus and being active citizens. So as I do on most nights, I want to thank you for doing that, and I want to urge you to do more. We are, even though Donald Trump doesn't think we are all in this together. That is the end of tonight's Resistance Report. I will see you tomorrow.